Welcome back, Motorized bike enthusiast. In today's video, we finally got a lemon of a motor, so we're going to make some lemonade. This motor is destined for the Path Dragon with a big bore cylinder for an upgrade on the trail rides. But unfortunately, out of the box, this motor had some major issues. Now, it's inevitable that if you're in this hobby for long enough, you're eventually going to get a bad motor. I've been pretty lucky, as within the past 4 years, I still have gotten only good motors that work. This one technically worked out of the box, but it had some blaring issues. And here at LA Hover Bikes, we find that reality beats technicality on a daily basis. But wait, there's more. Not only did the motor kit decide it was going to be that time of the month every day of the month, but the big bore kit had baldness-inducing issues of its own, which we're just going to add to this video because why not? The first issue we ran into on this motor was a damaged clutch, preventing me from starting the bike. Not only was it damaged, it was severely out of adjustment. One issue is easy to solve, the other is not. So I have an entire video about this linked in the description. I'm not covering it in this video because if I have to think about it again, I'm going to lay down in front of a log truck. We found our next issue while examining the exhaust. Turns out the internal integrity of this particular bolt, which holds on the cap, was incredibly skewed. If we would have ridden this bike, it would have gone from a DB level of Bob Ross to Karen triggered within about 5 seconds. And we found enough slag left over to feed the Iron Giant. We have one more major issue to deal with on this motor, which was oh so much fun, but let's go ahead and get the big bore kit out of the way real quick. I've always been under the impression that China is full of some pretty smart individuals. However, after using their products for so long, I begin to wonder. This is designed for a 40mm stroke. It's got the high hull piston. It does not, however, have its own dedicated head. You're meant to use the stock head that came with the motor, or source your own specifically designed for a 49mm piston. There's a problem with this. The stock head, designed for a 47mm piston, means that the squish area is further into the cylinder than is optimal for a 49, which essentially means with one base gasket and one head gasket, the piston is contacting the head, and we have no squish. I had to get creative with this. I looked at a couple of different options I had, some funky heads that might work, but at the end of the day, I decided to use the stock head with 2 custom base gaskets and 3 head gaskets. I never tried to use more than one head gasket before. I had no idea if this was going to work. So let's move on and find out. The first time I ever tried to use an iron sleeve cylinder with the Zeda 4040, it ended up scoring the walls within the first couple tanks of riding, and I'm never quite sure why. It might have simply been I wasn't gentle enough during the braking period, but I also did not condition the rings, i.e. sand the edges with high grit sandpaper, which is something I'm not going to make the mistake twice. So I took some 600 grit and very lightly smoothed out the edges of the piston rings. During break-in for the first 2 full tanks of gas, I used a mix of 25-to-1. I ensured that the motor was heating up for at least a minute before applying a load, and only cruised around at about half throttle with very short high throttle blips. Now, because break-in rides are not very entertaining, here's some homemade bangers instead. When you're working with something like a new big bore kit that was also ported, you are very tempted to just open it up and let it rip. We, however, did not do this, and waited until every last drop of that second tank was out of the motor. We then mixed up 32-to-1 and took it out for a nice little trail rip. Now keep in mind, the port work for this big bore kit was intended only for trail riding, so I wanted good low and mid-range torque. You guys know me. That's usually what I want. We aren't not really concerned with high RPMs, but I did put a tachometer on here because I was just curious to see what this thing was cruising at about. first real trail ride where we finally got to open the motor up and see what she's got, she was running pretty rough, and I suspected that the piston was hitting the head. During our first real trail ride, we only had 2 base gaskets and 1 thick head gasket. I thought I could get away with this, but measuring the squish on this was pretty tricky as the dome of the head doesn't really match the dome of the piston, so I was getting some funky readings. It was at this point where I decided to add the other 2 head gaskets. During close-up examination of the motor, I noticed that both seals were not properly seated into the motor. It's actually a wonder this thing ran at all. And one of the seals was damaged. Some of the rubber was stripped off as they didn't use any grease during installation of the seals, which you really need to do to prevent rubber from being shaved off by the crankshaft. So we're going to go ahead and replace the damaged one and fully seat both of them. Occasionally on my builds that use spring tensioners, I'll have an issue with lockup, where the chain will fold over inside the case of the motor, especially during startup. This particular bike has high compression and a crappy clutch, so it can slip a little bit while you're trying to start it from a cold start. So what I'll do is I'll fill in the space above the chain under the sprocket cover with quick steel epoxy putty or JB Weld, and they even sell a CNC machine component that you can stick in here. So if you run a chain tensioner on your builds, I highly recommend taking care of this because chain lockups can destroy bikes. I've seen some sketchy things on these kits before, but it usually just has to do with cheap quality of hardware. Never an actual manufacturing mistake that they tried to put a band-aid on and ship out the door. They drilled the holes for the cylinder studs way too deep, leaving only a few millimeters of material between the bottom of the studs and the actual crank of the motor. Under normal circumstances, you would screw the studs in too deep and you wouldn't be able to put the head on the motor. So to remedy the issue, they put spacers underneath the studs in the form of ball bearings. Now, I've disassembled quite a few of these motors up until now, and never once have I seen ball bearings in these holes. The scariest thought about this is the fact that you know this was a mass manufacturing mistake if they came up with an entire system of ball bearings to try and fix the issue. Which means, at some point in time, they drilled a bunch of cases way too deep and then shipped them all out with ball bearings at the bottom. And here's the problem. While tightening the studs with pretty light pressure, the bearings got pushed straight through the case and locked up the motor. This was mind-boggling at first, but I kind of figured exactly what it would be when I took the studs out and saw ball bearings in the bottom of the holes. At this point, I thought the case was trash, but I decided to go ahead and try and fix it. What can it hurt? It's either going to work, or it's still going to be trash. So I went ahead and pushed the bearings through all 4 of the holes because it's eventually going to be a problem, and I want to make sure I don't have to deal with it. I cleaned up the holes with a Dremel best I could at the angle, and then filled them with JB Weld. I decided to use the original JB Weld because I didn't want to take any chances, and we all know that the original is the strongest. The only problem is the set time is pretty long, so we had to leave it overnight to set and a full day after that to cure before we could really push the motor. You gotta love JB Weld. The repair, along with everything else we've done to the bike so far, appears to be working, and I have a good feeling this is going to be a strong upgrade for the Path Dragon. The big bore kit on the trail bike is something that desperately needed to really pull through some of the boggy areas. The port work, thanks to two-stroke ports, hits the ideal power band that I was looking for on this motor. Perfect in the mid-range, and just fine up top and down low. Yes, it does hit a wall. Once it gets up to about 6,500 RPMs, it doesn't really have anything else to give. But that's okay because I wasn't looking for anything in the high end. I was just looking for really strong low and mid-range pull, which is exactly what we got. So two-stroke ports, thank you very much. Anyways, we'll see how this bike holds up. I still got a lot of work to do. She's running a little rich at the time of filming. I've since fixed this and have it tuned out almost perfect right now. So look forward to a future video on that. Anyways, guys, let me know down in the comments, what's the jankiest thing you've ever had to try and fix on a motorized bike that actually worked? This should be good. And until next time, ride safe.